He was a carpenter with sawdust on his boots and a daughter to feed. She was worth $4 billion and hadn't trusted anyone in years. They shared one dinner, and by morning, the photographs were everywhere. Reporters called him a gold digger. Executives called her reckless. And somewhere across town, a powerful man with a hidden agenda was watching it all unfold exactly as he'd planned. What nobody counted on was what Ronan Whitaker would do when they came for his little girl. If this kind of story moves you the kind with real love, real stakes, and people who surprise you, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button right now. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Stay until the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The desk arrived at Lenora Blackthorne's hotel on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in moving blankets and riding in the back of a truck that had seen better decades. Ronan Whitaker rode with it personally, the way he always did with the restoration he'd put real time into, not because the contract required it, but because he didn't trust anyone else to handle the unloading. He stood in the service corridor, watching two of the hotel staff carry the piece inside, his arms crossed and his jaw tight until they set it down without incident. Then he exhaled. The desk was an 1890s roll-top, American walnut, with a cylinder mechanism that had been seized solid when the hotel first brought it to his workshop. Someone had tried to fix it themselves at some point badly and left behind stripped screws, mismatched wood filler the wrong shade by 3 tones, and what appeared to be a drywall screw jammed where a mortise joint should have been. Ronan had spent 11 days on it. He charged accordingly. The hotel manager led him up to the executive suite where the desk would be placed, and that was where he first saw her. Lenora Blackthorne was standing near the window, with a phone pressed to her ear, dressed in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Ronan's truck. She was in her 50s, composed in the particular way that comes not from ease but from discipline, the kind of composed that gets built over decades of walking into rooms where people underestimate you and learning not to show that you've noticed. She had dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, and she wore it back without apology. She glanced at the desk when the staff brought it in, finished her call, and walked over. Ronan was checking the cylinder mechanism one more time, running his thumb along the groove to confirm it moved the way it should. "That's better than I expected," she said. He looked up. "What were you expecting?" The finish looked close in the photographs. "I wasn't sure it would hold up in person." He straightened. "It holds up. I matched the original shellac formula. The color's going to shift slightly over the first few weeks as it breathes. It'll actually get closer to the original patina, not farther from it. Most people don't know that." Lenora looked at him with mild interest, the way someone looks at a person who has just said something marginally surprising. Most restorers don't explain that. Most restorers are happy to take the check and leave before you notice. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not quite a smile. The possibility of one. "You don't approve of how the previous restoration was handled," she said. "I don't disapprove of the person. I disapprove of the drywall screw." This time she did smile. It was brief and a little reluctant, like she'd decided to allow it against her better judgment. She asked him 2 or 3 specific questions about the restoration, genuinely technical questions, not the polite, kind people ask when they're really just waiting for you to stop talking. He answered them directly, and she listened without interrupting. Then she pointed to a section near the base of the cylinder where the stain met the older wood, and said that the transition looked uneven to her. Ronan crouched down and looked where she was pointing. "That's intentional," he said. "I could have blended it completely, but then you'd lose the record of the repair. In another 30 years, whoever works on this next would have no way of knowing what was original and what wasn't. I left the line visible on purpose. That seems like a decision you should have discussed with me before making it." He met her eyes. "You're right. I should have. Do you want me to blend it?" She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "I think I like knowing." He nodded and stood back up. They were quiet for a second, and then the hotel manager appeared in the doorway to ask about something else entirely and broke whatever thread had been forming. Ronan collected his moving blankets and paperwork, shook Lenora Blackthorne's hand. Her handshake was firm, unsurprised by his callus, and left. He didn't think much about it on the drive home. He was thinking about whether he'd remembered to buy the Searcel Sadie wanted, and whether the Anderson commission was going to come through, and whether the noise the truck had started making near the highway on-ramp was the alternator or something worse. He was not thinking about Lenora Blackthorne. Sadie was 8 years old and had opinions about everything. She had opinions about breakfast, about which sneakers were acceptable for school, about the correct way to stack firewood, and about which of her father's ongoing projects she found interesting versus boring. She delivered these opinions without hesitation and with the particular certainty of a child who has been listened to, enough to believe that what she thinks matters. She was eating cereal at the kitchen table. Ronan had remembered when he got home that evening, with a library book propped against the fruit bowl and her socked feet curled under her on the chair. "How was the delivery?" she asked, without looking up. "Clean. Did they break it?" "They did not break it." "Did you watch them the whole time?" "I watched them the whole time." She turned a page. Good. Sadie knew the difference between his furniture and other people's. She'd grown up in the workshop, which had started in the garage of the house, where they still lived a two-bedroom craftsman, in a neighborhood where the houses were close together, and the trees were old, and the street was quiet enough that kids could still ride bikes on it. After his wife Marissa left when Sadie was 3, the workshop had expanded into the actual garage and then into a rented space 2 streets over. The house stayed the same size. That was a choice Ronan had made deliberately, though he couldn't always articulate why. Something about not wanting Sadie to feel like things were getting bigger and emptier at the same time. Marissa was not a villain in the story of Ronan's life. She had been 25 when Sadie was born, not ready in ways neither of them had been honest about before the baby came, and she had eventually made the painful, clear-eyed decision to leave rather than stay and be miserable in a way Sadie would absorb. She called on birthdays. She sent gifts at Christmas. She'd moved to Portland and remarried someone who suited her in ways Ronan apparently hadn't. He didn't think about her often, and when he did, it was without heat. He'd had 2 relationships since then. One lasted 8 months, ended because she'd wanted to move, and he hadn't been willing to uproot Sadie. The other lasted 5 months and had dissolved quietly, the way things do when neither person is really wrong, but the fit isn't there. He'd been alone for the past 2 years, not miserable about it. Not particularly content about it either, just occupied. The workshop occupied most of his non-Sadie hours. He was good at it and growing a small reputation for it, mostly through word of mouth, a few trade connections, and one favorable mention in an architectural magazine that had brought in 3 commissions he wouldn't have found otherwise. He wasn't getting rich. He was getting by, with occasional months that were better than getting by. And the work gave him something to organize his days around that he actually cared about. This was, as far as Ronan Whitaker was concerned, enough. The call came 4 days after the hotel delivery. He was in the workshop, fitting a drawer slide on a commission for a restaurant in the Arts District, when his phone showed an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He picked up instead. Mr. Whitaker. The voice was familiar, composed. He set down the slide. Ms. Blackthorne. I'm calling to ask if you'd be available for dinner Friday evening. A brief pause. I have a few questions about the desk. There are some considerations for another piece I'm thinking about commissioning, and I'd find it easier to discuss them over a meal than over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. Friday, he said. At 8. I can send you the address. He'd almost said I have a daughter. The instinct to use Sadie as a shield was well worn by now, an easy way to sidestep things without having to examine why he was sidestepping them. But Mrs. Carver next door was always willing to stay with Sadie on short notice, and Sadie liked her, and none of that was the real reason he was hesitating. All right, he said, Friday. He stood in the workshop for a moment after hanging up, holding his phone, not quite sure what had just happened. Then he went back to the drawer slide. He wore the same jacket he wore to client meetings and to school performances and to funerals, navy blue, bought 4 years ago, still fit. He was aware of this fact when the car he'd been given the address for turned out to be a restaurant he'd heard of but never had occasion to enter. Fenwick's was the kind of place that didn't have a sign you could see from the street. Ronan stood outside for a moment, looking at the subtle brass lettering beside the door, his work boots, cleaned but still work boots, and took stock of himself. Then he went in. Lenora was already seated, of course. She was at a corner table with a clear view of the room, and her back to the wall in the way of someone who has learned to control sight lines. She was wearing something dark and simple and expensive, and she looked entirely at home, which was the point. He crossed the room toward her. A few people looked up. He was not self-conscious by nature, but he was acutely aware that he was the only person in the restaurant whose jacket had come from a department store. You found it, she said when he sat. I had to look up whether there was a parking lot. There's a garage on Clement Street. I know, I found it. She studied him for a moment. Not unkindly, but directly, the way she'd looked at the desk. "You're uncomfortable." "I'm adjusting," he said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" A waiter appeared and recited something elaborate about the evening's selections. Lenora listened with the automatic attention of someone who'd heard it 100 times. Ronan listened carefully because he actually needed the information. They ordered. Wine arrived. Ronan took a sip of something that tasted frankly like money. "So," he said, "the desk questions." Lenora looked at him. "You mentioned you had questions about the restoration. Commission considerations." She set her wine glass down. "I do have questions. I also thought it would be pleasant to have dinner with someone who told me the truth about a drywall screw." He looked at her across the candlelight. "That's a low bar. It's an increasingly rare quality." He turned his glass on the tablecloth, thinking. "You have people around you all the time who tell you what you want to hear. I have people around me all the time who tell me what they believe will protect their access to me." She said it without bitterness. Straightforward statement of fact. It produces a similar effect but is significantly less useful. Doesn't that get exhausting? Enormously. But one learns to manage. The food came. Ronan ate and she ate, and they talked about other things for a while. The hotel, its architecture, what he knew about walnut versus cherry for restoration work, what she'd originally wanted to do with the executive suite before she'd been overruled by the designer she'd hired. She had a dry wit she deployed casually, without fanfare, and he found himself matching it in a way that surprised him. He wasn't particularly charming, had never thought of himself as someone who was good at this kind of conversation. But she made it feel less like performance than like argument, and he was better at argument. It was during a quiet stretch after the main course and before anything else arrived that he said it. "Can I ask you something? You can ask." "Why me?" He wasn't coy about it. "You're a billionaire. You control a hotel chain. I restore furniture for a living and raise an 8-year-old in a 2-bedroom house. I genuinely don't understand what the calculation is here." Lenora considered this with what appeared to be honest deliberation. She wasn't offended by the question. She was thinking about how to answer it accurately. "I spent 20 minutes talking to you about a desk joint," she said finally, "and you never once looked at my watch." He frowned. "Your watch?" "Most men in that suite spent the entire meeting tracking whether I was impressed with them. You spent it looking at the wood." She lifted her glass. "I found it restoring." He laughed, not a polished laugh, but an honest one, the kind that catches you before you can decide whether to allow it. She smiled again. Still brief, still like a concession. "I should tell you," Ronan said, "that I have an 8-year-old at home who is the primary organizing fact of my life. That's not going away, and I'm not looking for anyone to fund my operation or give me a step up or whatever the version of that is in your world. I'm not built for complicated. I'm not offering complicated. You are literally the most complicated thing I've encountered since my truck's alternator." She set her glass down and looked at him across the table with something that was not quite amusement and not quite seriousness, but some particular combination of the two. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "if I were 20 years younger, I'd make you fall for me. Since I'm not," she paused, unhurried, "I suppose I'll have to make you fall for me exactly as I am." He went very still. The candlelight held. A fork clinked somewhere in the room. Outside on the street, an ordinary Friday night continued. Ronan Whitaker looked at Lenora Blackthorne across a table that cost more per hour than his workshop made on a good day, and felt something shift in the arrangement of things he'd told himself were settled. That was, he said, when he trusted himself to say something, extremely unfair. "Yes." She lifted her wine. "I know. They stayed another hour. They talked about Sadie. He mentioned her twice before he caught himself, and then mentioned her a third time anyway, because what was the point of not? Lenora asked a specific question about the drawings Sadie had apparently left scattered on the workshop floor the day of the delivery, which Ronan hadn't known she'd noticed. He told her Sadie had been going through a maps phase. She'd been drawing imaginary countries and their topography with a thoroughness that he privately found both impressive and slightly exhausting. Lenora said she draws the rivers too, and the elevation markers. A pause. "When I was young, I did the same thing." She said it like she was reporting something mildly surprising from a distance. "Nobody I've told that to in 40 years has known what an elevation marker was." Ronan looked at her. Outside, when they parted, she had a car waiting. He had his truck in the Clement Street garage. They stood briefly on the sidewalk, and there was a moment that could have been something, and wasn't. Quite. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "Thank you for the honest assessment of the desk." He nodded, put his hands in his jacket pockets, and started toward the garage. He was halfway down the block when he heard her say, quietly and without raising her voice, "Ronan." He stopped. "The elevation markers," she said. "Tell her they're worth the trouble." He stood there a moment, not turning around. Then he kept walking. He didn't see the photographer across the street. Nobody did. But the photograph was already taken. The photograph ran in 3 publications before Ronan even knew it existed. He found out the way most people find out that their life has changed without their permission from someone else. Specifically, from his neighbor Dennis, who knocked on the workshop door at 7:15 on a Saturday morning holding his phone out like it was evidence of something. "Is this you?" Dennis said. Ronan took the phone. The image was grainy in the way that photographs taken from across a street at night tend to be high contrast, slightly blurred at the edges, the kind of quality that nonetheless conveys everything it needs to. Lenora Blackthorne stood on the sidewalk outside Fenwick's in her dark coat, and Ronan Whitaker stood a few feet from her in his navy department store jacket, and whatever was happening in the space between them, it was the kind of thing a photographer would stop walking to capture. The headline under it read, "Blackthorne Hotel's CEO in mystery dinner with unidentified man, who is he?" Below that, in smaller text, sources confirmed the billionaire dined privately for over 2 hours. Ronan handed the phone back. "That's me," he said. Dennis looked at him with an expression that contained several things at once: curiosity, concern, something adjacent to envy. "Ronan, that's Lenora Blackthorne. I know who it is. She's worth like I know what she's worth." Dennis opened and closed his mouth. "Then are you okay?" Ronan looked past him at the street, which was still quiet, still ordinary, still the street he'd lived on for 6 years. "Yeah," he said, "I'm fine." He was not particularly fine. But the shape of what he wasn't fine about hadn't fully assembled itself yet, and until it did, there was no point in discussing it. He went inside and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his own phone, scrolling through what had accumulated overnight. By then there were 4 articles. By the time he'd finished his first cup, there were 7. Most of them had identified him. It hadn't taken long. Apparently, the hotel's records were not especially private, and a restoration contract was a matter of a few calls to confirm. By his second cup, his name was in print alongside phrases like mystery man, carpenter, single father, and in one outlet that seemed particularly pleased with itself, Cinderella in reverse. That last one he stared at for a moment. Then he put his phone face down on the table. Sadie came downstairs at 8, still in her pajamas, hair sideways from sleep. She poured herself cereal, sat across from him, and regarded him with the particular attention of a child who can tell something is different before being told what. "You have your thinking face," she said. "Just tired." She ate a spoonful. "Did something happen with the hotel desk?" "No, the desk is fine." "Then what?" He picked up his phone, turned it over, set it back down. "I had dinner with someone last night. It ended up in the news." Sadie processed this with the deliberateness she applied to most things. "Why?" "Because the person I had dinner with is famous." "Who?" "Her name is Lenora Blackthorne. She owns the hotel where I delivered the desk." Another spoonful. A pause. "Is she nice?" Ronan thought about that for a moment with more sincerity than the question probably required. "She's direct," he said. "She's sharp. She noticed your maps on the workshop floor." Sadie looked up. "She did?" She asked about the elevation markers. His daughter considered this information seriously. The way she considered elevation markers with the full weight of someone who understood their importance. "Okay," she said, and went back to her cereal. That was for the moment. That Lenora called at 9:30. He was in the workshop by then. Not accomplishing much, he'd been standing at the bench, moving a chisel from one spot to another, and thinking, which was not productive but felt necessary. "You've seen it," she said when he picked up. Not a question. "I've seen it. I want to apologize." I didn't anticipate. She stopped. Started again. "That's not entirely accurate. I should have anticipated it. I've dealt with press attention for 20 years. I simply wasn't thinking about it at the time, which is my failure, not yours." He leaned against the bench. "How often does this happen to you?" "Not often. I'm careful, usually." A pause. "I was less careful than usual." He didn't ask why. He had a reasonable guess. "What happens now?" he asked instead. "The stories run for a few days. If there's nothing to feed them, they move on. My communications team is recommending no statement, which is the correct call. The less I acknowledge it, the faster it dies. And if it doesn't die fast, then it takes longer." She said this with a flatness that he recognized as its own kind of emotion, the flatness of someone who has been here before and learned to hold it without flinching. I'm sorry you're in the middle of this, Ronan. You didn't ask for it. No, he agreed, I didn't. A silence, not uncomfortable exactly. Waited. For what it's worth, she said, and then seemed to decide something. I had a very good evening, despite the current circumstances. He looked at the workshop wall where he'd pinned Sadie's most recent imaginary country. She'd named it Verath, and it had a mountain range along the northern coast that she'd spent 3 days getting right. Yeah, he said, so did I. The stories did not die in a few days. They mutated, which is what stories do when there are people actively feeding them. By Monday, there were pieces speculating about the nature of the relationship. By Tuesday, someone had found his business website and written a breathless summary of Whitaker Custom Restorations that managed to make a legitimate 11-year-old woodworking operation sound simultaneously quaint and suspicious. By Wednesday, the framing had shifted from mystery dinner to something uglier. Profile pieces about men who target wealthy women, think pieces about power imbalances, one particularly grim column that used the phrase age gap 17 times in 8 paragraphs. Ronan read enough of it to understand the shape of what was being built. Then he stopped reading. His phone, however, did not stop receiving. By Thursday, he had 43 messages from numbers he didn't recognize, 2 voicemails from journalists, and a text from his cousin in Ohio who wanted to know if the news was true, and if so, whether he'd lost his mind. He replied, "It's complicated. I'm fine." His cousin replied, "Call me." He didn't call. What he did was show up at Sadie's school on Thursday afternoon and stand by the chain-link fence where the parents gathered at pickup and feel, for the first time, the specific discomfort of being looked at, not stared at, exactly, but noticed. A few conversations that seemed to pause when he arrived and resume at a slightly different register. A mother he'd talked to a dozen times at these pickups, who found something to look at on her phone when he made eye contact. He wasn't certain he was reading it right. He was certain enough to feel the chill of it. Sadie came out with her backpack and her library book and a drawing she'd made in art class, and she was talking, before she reached the fence, explaining something about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Priya about whether the mountains in Verath could realistically support a river system given the elevation, and Ronan listened and said the right things and held her hand as they walked to the truck. She didn't mention anyone looking at her. He didn't ask. That night, after she was in bed, he called Lenora. She picked up on the second ring. "Tell me honestly," he said, without preamble. "How long does this actually last?" A pause. "Honestly?" "That's what I said. In my experience without new material, 3 to 5 weeks before the press attention fades significantly. The residual searches, the online pieces, those stay indexed longer, but they stop being actively circulated. 3 to 5 weeks. Yes, he was quiet. "Ronan," she said carefully. "Has something happened?" "Nothing specific. The atmosphere at school pickup was different today." Another pause, this one longer, and with a different quality. "I see. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't say." "She may not have." A beat. "Children are more perceptive than we assume, though." "I know what my kid perceives," he said, with an edge he hadn't entirely intended. "I know you do. Not defensive, I'm sorry," he exhaled. Pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. "It's not your fault. Some of it is." He didn't argue with that, because some of it was, and he respected her too much to pretend otherwise. "I need to think," he said. "Of course. I'm not going anywhere. I just need to think." A breath. "Ronan, for what it's worth, I don't do this. I want you to know that. I don't call carpenters I've met once and ask them to dinner. I don't," she stopped. "I'm not explaining myself well." "You're explaining yourself fine. What I'm trying to say is that I knew what I was doing when I called. I thought it through. I simply underestimated the collateral." "The collateral," he repeated. That was a poor word choice. "Little bit. I mean the people near you. I underestimated the reach of it." He shifted the phone to his other ear. Through the wall, Sadie's nightlight made a thin yellow line under her door. "Yeah," he said. "So did I. They had a second dinner, though it was nothing like the first. It was Lenora's suggestion. Made carefully, she offered her house rather than a restaurant, private enough that no photographer could reasonably access it, which said something about both her foresight and the way her life had been organized to accommodate exactly this kind of necessity. Ronan drove Sadie to Mrs. Carver's, made sure she had the iPad and the good snacks, and then drove across the city to an address in a neighborhood where the houses sat behind gates and trees, and the quiet was a different kind of quiet than his street managed rather than natural. The gate code she'd texted him worked. The driveway was long. The house, when it appeared, was the kind of building that announced itself without trying, not ostentatious but unmistakably significant. the way certain people are unmistakably significant. He sat in his truck for a moment in the driveway, engine running, looking at it. Then he shut the engine off and got out. She met him at the door herself, which he'd half expected her not to. She was dressed plainly by her standards: dark trousers, a gray top, no jewelry except the simple watch she always wore. Her hair was down. He hadn't seen it down before. "You found it," she said, which was what she'd said at the restaurant. "I had the code," he said, which was not what he'd said at the restaurant. She stepped aside to let him in. The house was warmer inside than its exterior suggested. That surprised him. He'd been braced for the kind of interior that functions as a monument to the owner's net worth, the kind of furnishings that exist to be recognized and valued rather than used. But the rooms he moved through were lived in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was a stack of trade publications on the kitchen island, a half-finished glass of water on the counter, a window seat in the front room that had a blanket on it, slightly crumpled, the way a blanket looks when someone actually sits there. He noticed the furniture because he always noticed furniture, and some of it was very good: a 19th century secretary desk against the far wall of the study, a dining table that was either an exceptional original or a reproduction so precise as to be indistinguishable. But the arrangement of it all had the feeling of someone who chose things because she wanted them, not because they sent a message. "Sit wherever you want," she said. "I was going to cook, and then I realized I haven't cooked in anything more ambitious than eggs in approximately 4 years. So there's food from a restaurant I actually trust." "What kind of food?" "Lebanese. Is that all right?" "That's great." They sat at the kitchen island and ate from containers, which felt more honest than the restaurant had, though the food was better than anything Ronan had eaten in recent memory. He said so, and she seemed genuinely pleased, the way people are pleased when you appreciate the specific thing they chose for you. "The press has been worse than I said it would be," she said after a while. "Not an opening. A confession. I know, I have people monitoring it. The volume is higher than a typical story of this kind, which suggests someone is amplifying it." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the usual pattern is that an initial piece runs, gets picked up organically, and fades. This pattern is different. The pieces are appearing in outlets that don't typically chase this kind of story. The framing is consistent across publications that don't usually coordinate." She said it the way she'd said things about the desk, precisely, without embellishment, as if precision were a form of respect. "Someone is pushing it. Who? I have my suspicions. I'm not in a position to say them out loud yet." He set down his fork. "Lenora, if someone is deliberately doing this, I'm handling it. That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I'm aware of what you asked. I'm telling you that I'm handling it, which is the most accurate answer I can give you right now." He studied her. There was something in her face, not quite fear, not quite anger, something more disciplined than either. A specific kind of awareness that comes from understanding that the threat is real, but performing calm is still the only useful response. "How long have you been dealing with things like this alone?" he said. She went still for a moment. "A long time," she said. "Running a company this size, a woman without a partner, there are people who spend careers waiting for you to show weakness. You learn to handle things before anyone can use them against you. That sounds exhausting. You said that at the restaurant." "It's still true," she smiled briefly at her food.
"Yes."
"It is." He watched her for a moment. She was assembling something quietly in her expression, sorting through what to say next with the careful deliberateness he was coming to recognize as her particular form of honesty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Does it bother you?" "The age." He didn't answer immediately. She deserved a real answer, not the quick one. "Not the way you mean it," he said finally. "When I'm talking to you, I don't think about it. When I see the headlines, I think about it, but only because I know other people are thinking about it, and that changes things in a practical sense. But as a fact in itself," he shook his head. "No, it doesn't bother me." She received this without the smile he might have expected. Instead, she looked at him with the careful attention she gave things she was deciding whether to trust. "What does bother you?" she said. Not a question quite. An invitation, the distance, he said. Not age. Distance. "You live like this." He gestured at the room around them, not unkindly, just honestly. "I live with a kid in a workshop, and a truck that may or may not need a new alternator. Those aren't the same world, Lenora. When the headline writers talk about us, the thing they're wrong about is the direction. It's not your money that makes me uncertain. It's whether someone from your world actually wants to spend time in mine." She looked at him for a long moment. "I spent 20 minutes this week." she said slowly, in a meeting about projected revenue across 11 properties, and I thought about your daughter's rivers. He held very still. I thought about the fact that she draws them where the geology would logically put them. And it was the most genuinely interesting thing I'd thought about all week. A pause. Make of that what you will. He made of it quite a lot, privately, and said she'd be pleased to know that. I suspect she'd be more interested in whether my feedback on her northern mountain range was geologically sound. Was it? I'd have to see the full map. He laughed that same unguarded laugh from the restaurant, the one that happened before he decided to allow it. And Lenora sat across from him on a kitchen stool in a house that cost more than his entire block, and laughed with him. And the sound of it was not a billionaire's laugh. It was just a person's laugh, the real kind that you can't manufacture. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about the Anderson commission, a dining set for a restaurant, more complicated than his usual work, with a design element the client kept changing. She told him about the board meeting she had in 2 weeks that she'd been preparing for since January, and the degree to which preparing for it had consumed her in a way she didn't entirely resent, but couldn't admit out loud to anyone who worked for her. You can't tell the people who depend on you when you're scared, she said. The moment you do, everything shifts. I know that one, he said. Different scale. Same thing, she looked at him. Single parent, he said. You don't show them the fear. You'd terrify them. Yes, she said. Exactly that. It was past 11 when he left. They stood at the front door, and this time the moment that could have been something was closer to something than it had been on the sidewalk outside Fenwick's. But neither of them moved toward it. There was something unsettled between them that wasn't bad, exactly, but wasn't resolved. I'll be in touch, she said. I know, he said. He drove home through streets that were mostly empty, the city in that specific late-night mode where it looks like a version of itself that's been filtered down to essentials. He picked up Sadie from Mrs. Carver's, carried her to the truck half asleep, got her into her own bed with the minimum of disturbance, checked the lock, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the small hallway of his house for a moment in the dark. He was not a man who fell easily. He knew this about himself. He'd watched other people fall fast and hard, and had always found it slightly foreign, the way you find foreign anything that doesn't match your own internal machinery. But something was moving in him. Slowly, the way things move when they are large and not built for speed but moving. He went to bed. The photographs that changed everything appeared 6 days later. Not from the first dinner, those had already run and been absorbed into the news cycle's restless metabolism. These were new. Someone had gotten a shot of Ronan arriving at Lenora's house. The angle was from outside the gate, which meant someone had been waiting with a telephoto lens, which meant this was not accidental. These ran with a different kind of headline. The polite mystery dinner framing had been replaced entirely. Now the language was pointed, deliberate, unmistakably structured to wound. Blackthorne's young companion makes a second visit to her private home. Sources say she's smitten. Is the billionaire being taken for a ride? A separate piece, published simultaneously on a financial news site, posed what it called legitimate questions about whether Lenora Blackthorne's recent personal distractions might affect her focus ahead of what the article described as a pivotal moment for Blackthorne hotels. Ronan read that second piece 3 times. Then he sat with the specific chill of understanding that this was not celebrity gossip. This was something else entirely, something that had Lenora's company in its sights, and was using him to get there. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, unknown number. The kind journalists use. He let it ring. Then it rang again, and when he finally checked his messages, there were 6 of them, and 2 of them were from people he vaguely knew, a guy he'd gone to school with, a former client who'd sent the articles with messages that were well-meaning, in the way that messages are well-meaning, when the person sending them is also curious to know if the gossip is true. He called Lenora. She picked up immediately, which meant she'd been waiting for his call. You've seen the new ones, he said. Yes, the financial piece. Yes, Lenora. He kept his voice level. Who is doing this? A silence, longer than the others. There is a man named Victor Halden, she said. He is a senior executive in my company. He has been positioning himself for a board challenge for approximately 18 months. The vote, I mentioned the one in 2 weeks if he can create sufficient doubt about my judgment before then. There are 3 board members whose allegiance is not certain. Ronan sat down on the workshop stool. He's using me, he said. To make you look reckless. Yes. And you knew this when? Another pause. I suspected it 3 days ago. I didn't want to tell you until I was more certain. That was your call to make? No, she said, without hesitation. It wasn't. I should have told you. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was a response forming that was made up of several things: anger, some fear, a recognition that this was the moment where the real nature of her world made itself plain. Not the money, not the restaurants, this, the kind of enemies she accumulated just by existing in the space she occupied. My daughter goes to school, he said. She goes to school every day, and the parents there are already starting to. He stopped. If this man has resources, I'm aware of what he has. I promise you I'm aware of it. Then why haven't you? Because anything I do publicly to counter him before the vote happens plays into exactly what he wants. He wants me reactive. He wants me to look destabilized. Her voice was careful and controlled, and he could hear beneath it what it cost her to stay that way. If I come out swinging at him now in the press, it confirms his narrative. I have to appear unaffected until I have something concrete. And in the meantime, yes, I know how that sounds. Ronan put his free hand flat on the workbench. Tell me something honestly. All right. Is there any actual thing between his reach and Sadie? A long pause. Right now, Lenora said, there's no direct threat to her. The press attention can be painful, but it is not what you're asking about. The answer is no. Not right now. Not right now was not the same as no, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. I need a few days, he said. Okay, I'm not saying I'm done with this. Okay, she said again. I just need to think without the phone ringing every 40 minutes. I understand. A breath. Ronan. I'm sorry, I know that's inadequate. It's not inadequate. It's just complicated. You told me you weren't built for complicated. Yeah. He looked at the workshop wall. Sadie's map of Verath, the rivers running where the geology would logically put them. I did say that. He hung up. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray, the kind of flat winter light that makes everything look like it's waiting for something to happen. Ronan sat in his workshop and looked at the map and thought about a 50-year-old woman sitting across a kitchen island eating Lebanese food from containers, telling him she'd spent a week thinking about his daughter's rivers. He thought about the line she'd delivered over candlelight at Fenwick's, the one that had stopped him cold and never quite let go. I'll have to make you fall for me exactly as I am. He thought about the photograph someone had taken while waiting outside her gate with a telephoto lens. The calculation in that. The patience of it. He thought about Sadie and the school and the parents with their phones. And then he stopped thinking and picked up a piece of cherry he'd been meaning to start shaping all week. And he worked until it was dark outside, because there was nothing else to do right now that was real and useful and his. And sometimes that was the only way through. The cherry wood didn't help as much as he'd hoped. He worked 3 evenings in a row after that phone call. Long sessions in the workshop after Sadie was in bed, shaping and planing and fitting joints until his shoulders ached and the sawdust had settled into every crease of his hands. It was the kind of work that usually quieted his mind. This time the mind kept going, running the same loops it had been running since he'd read the words "not right now" in Lenora's voice and understood exactly what they left unspoken. The press didn't quiet either. He'd stopped reading the articles directly a decision that was right and also cost him something, because not reading meant not knowing, and not knowing produced its own low-grade dread. He could feel the stories out there without seeing them, the way you can feel weather changing before it arrives. His phone registered it the uptick in unknown callers, the messages from distant acquaintances, the way his business email, which usually received inquiries about furniture and nothing else, now contained a mix of genuine commissions and things that were harder to categorize. One email asked if he was available for an interview. Another said he ought to be ashamed of himself. A third was from a woman who said she respected what he was doing and hoped it worked out. He deleted all 3 without replying and called his accountant to ask about adjusting the workshop's privacy settings on its directory listings, which his accountant found confusing. Just make it so. The address isn't the first thing that comes up, Ronan said. Are you getting threats? Not exactly. Just attention I didn't ask for. A pause. I saw the news. Everyone has seen the news. Ronan, she's really... I know who she is, Phil. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then, are you okay? It was the second time in a week someone had asked him that. He gave Phil the same answer he'd given Dennis, I'm fine. And like with Dennis, it was approximately true, and not particularly the point. The moment that changed the calculation came on a Thursday, 11 days after the second set of photographs ran. Sadie came home from school and went straight upstairs without stopping in the workshop doorway, the way she usually did. This was a deviation from pattern, significant enough that Ronan noticed it immediately. He tracked her patterns the way a craftsman tracks grain direction, automatically, without deciding to. He finished the joint he was fitting, washed his hands, and went inside. She was in her room, sitting at her desk with her maps spread in front of her, but she wasn't drawing. She was sitting very still in the way children sit when they are trying to decide whether to say something. He leaned in the doorway. "Hey." She looked up. Her face was doing the thing it did when she'd been working to keep it composed, a slight tension around her mouth, her eyes a little too focused, the specific expression of a child who has decided not to cry and is currently succeeding but at a cost. "Hey," she said. "How was school?" "Fine." He came in and sat on the edge of her bed, which put him lower than her at the desk, a position he took deliberately sometimes when the conversation needed to not feel like an interrogation. "Sadie." She looked at her map. Her finger traced the northern mountain range she'd been refining for 2 weeks. Some kids were talking about the lady in the news. He kept his voice steady. "What were they saying?" "They said you're in the news because you want her money." A pause. "Priya said her mom saw the article and said the lady is old enough to be your mom." Another pause, this one shorter. "I said she wasn't." "Because she isn't. You're 32. "I am 32, he agreed. "I did the math. She's 18 years older than you." 18 years, yeah. Sadie's finger stopped moving on the map. "Do you like her?" He looked at his daughter, her serious face, the maps she'd been drawing since she was 6, the elevation markers she'd learned because she'd wanted to be accurate and had taught herself what accuracy required. He thought about Lenora saying, "She draws the rivers where the geology would logically put them," and the particular quality of recognition in her voice when she said it. "Yeah," he said, "I like her." Sadie absorbed this. "Did you know she was going to be in the news when you went to dinner?" "No, I didn't think about it." "But now we're in the news." "We're adjacent to it," he said. "There's a difference." She considered this distinction. "Priya's mom looked at me funny today at pickup." He felt something close in his chest. Not fast, not dramatic, a slow, definitive closing, like a door being shut with proper care. "Did Priya look at you funny?" he asked. "No, Priya doesn't care. She just thinks it's interesting." A faint trace of something near amusement crossed Sadie's face, the particular affection she had for Priya's approach to most things. She said, "You're apparently very handsome in the photos, which is weird because you're just dad." "Thanks, Sadie. I'm just saying what she said." He sat with her for a few more minutes, looking at the map of Varath, and she told him she'd been thinking about whether the river delta on the eastern coast was geologically plausible given the sediment patterns she'd been researching. He listened and said it seemed plausible to him. She said she'd look into it more. He said that sounded right. When he came back downstairs, he stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hand on the counter and the closed feeling in his chest still there, settled and clear, and not going anywhere. He knew what he was going to do. He'd known since the moment she said, "Priya's mom looked at me funny." He just hadn't assembled it into a decision yet. Now it assembled itself. He called Lenora that evening, after Sadie was in bed, standing in the backyard in the cold because he didn't want to risk being overheard. She answered on the first ring this time. "I need to stop," he said. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. He counted later in memory. "I understand," she said. "It's Sadie. The attention is reaching her. I can manage it for myself. I cannot manage it for an 8-year-old who has to go to school every day and face parents who he stopped. I can't do that to her, Ronan." Her voice was very controlled. "You don't have to explain it." "I know. I'm explaining it anyway because you deserve that." Another silence. Shorter. "What do you need from me?" "I need it to stop." The contact, the whatever this was becoming. "I need it to stop so the story stops having new material." "I know." A breath. "I won't contact you. I'll tell my communications team to let it run out with no further input." A pause. "I'm sorry that I didn't protect you from this better. You couldn't have known it would land here." "No. But I should have considered the possibility more carefully." He didn't argue with that either. He was past the point of distributing or withholding blame. That kind of accounting felt beside the point when the only thing that mattered was the image of Sadie sitting very still at her desk with her finger on a mountain range she'd spent 3 days getting right. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," a pause. "Tell her the rivers are right." He stood in the cold backyard for a while after he hung up. The sky was overcast, no stars, just that flat orange urban glow that sits over a city at night and makes the dark feel inhabited rather than empty. A dog barked somewhere 2 blocks over. A car passed on the cross street. He went back inside. The weeks that followed were quieter than he'd expected, and harder in a different way than he'd expected. The press attention did begin to recede. Lenora's communications team had apparently executed the no-statement strategy with discipline, and without new photographs or developments to report, the story lost oxygen. Within 10 days, it had mostly dropped off the first page of search results. Within 3 weeks, it was the kind of thing you'd only find if you were already looking. The school returned to normal, mostly. The mother, who'd found something on her phone to look at during pickup, began making eye contact again. Ronan registered this without satisfaction or bitterness, just filed it in the category of information about how people behave when the narrative around them changes. He worked. He took on 2 new commissions: a library installation for a house in the hills, complex enough to require significant planning, and a repair job on a Victorian sideboard that turned out to be more structurally compromised than the owner had been told when she bought it. He spent a Saturday at a lumberyard in the east part of the city selecting walnut for the library job, which was one of the specific pleasures of his work, the part where you stand among the raw material and work out, board by board, which pieces have the grain you need. Sadie had settled back into her routine. She finished the Verith map. The Eastern Delta question had resolved itself in her satisfaction, following 3 days of cross-referencing against a book on river systems she'd checked out from the school library. She started a new country, unnamed as yet, with a complex coastline, and what she described as a complicated political situation, which she'd apparently decided to incorporate into the geographic documentation. Can a country's geography affect its politics? She asked one evening at dinner. Absolutely, Ronan said. How? He thought about it. Mountains make borders. Rivers determine trade. Coastlines decide who can be invaded and who can invade. Geography is most of it, actually, in the early stages. She chewed this over alongside her pasta. I'm going to add a contested border region. That sounds historically accurate. She seemed satisfied. She went back to eating. He was all right. He told himself this and mostly believed it. He missed the conversations with Lenora that was specific and real, and he didn't try to talk himself out of it, because lying to himself about what he felt had never served him. He missed the way she listened, the precision of it, the way she asked questions as if the answers actually mattered to her. He missed sitting across from her and feeling like the person he was talking to was genuinely paying attention. But he'd made the right call. He knew that too, with the same certainty. He was 4 weeks into the quiet when the car showed up. It was a Tuesday, just past noon. He was in the workshop when he heard a vehicle pull up outside, not an unusual sound. Deliveries came regularly, but this one idled longer than a delivery would. He registered it with a portion of his attention and kept working. Then the knock came. Not on the workshop door, on the front door of the house. He set down his plane and went through the interior passage to the front of the house, unlocked the door, and opened it. The man standing on his porch was somewhere in his mid-50s, tall, with the particular quality of grooming that signals not merely wealth, but the kind of wealth that has been tended and maintained over decades. Silver-haired, a coat that fit with the precision of custom tailoring. His face was arranged in an expression of deliberate pleasantness that had nothing of actual pleasure in it. Mr. Whitaker, the man said. My name is Victor Halden. Ronan went very still. He'd known the name for weeks. Lenora had given it to him the night she'd told him about the board challenge, the coordination behind the press campaign. He'd built a shape of the man in his mind from that conversation and from the things he'd inferred. The shape had been right in its broad outlines. The specific reality of him standing on the porch was something different. I know who you are, Ronan said. Victor's pleasant expression remained in place, unhurried. I imagine you do. May I come in? A brief pause. The pleasantness didn't waver. I understand. We can talk here then. He glanced down the street in both directions, the gesture of a man who is used to managing his surroundings. I want to speak with you about a matter that affects both of us. I doubt that. I think you'll find it's relevant. He adjusted slightly, a small shift of weight that managed to suggest confidence without aggression. The attention you've been experiencing, the press, the disruption to your business and your personal life, I'm in a position to make that stop permanently. Within the week. Ronan looked at him. In exchange, Victor continued, I'd need something modest from you. A statement. A brief public comment. It doesn't need to be long or detailed, that describes your experience with Ms. Blackthorne as having been initiated by her, that the relationship was something you were uncomfortable with, that you feel your position was taken advantage of. That's a lie. It's a framing, Victor said mildly. Most public statements are. I said it's a lie. Victor looked at him with the patience of someone who has prepared for this response and has subsequent responses ready. Mr. Whitaker, you're a single parent. You run a small business. You've had 4 weeks of press attention that, by any measure, has been damaging to your reputation and disruptive to your daughter's school environment. He said daughter with a precision that was not accidental. I'm offering you a resolution to all of it, in exchange for a statement that, frankly, many people in your position would consider reasonable. Get off my porch, Ronan said. Victor's eyes stayed level. Your daughter attends Meridian Elementary. She's in the 3rd grade, Mr. Cassidy's class. The cold that moved through Ronan then was not anger. Anger was something he knew. The shape of it was hot and directional and had an outlet. This was different. This was the particular temperature of a threat made against something you'd die before you let anyone touch. And it had no outlet because the correct response to it was not action, but absolute stillness. She's also, Victor continued, at the same unhurried pace, been spending a fair amount of time in the school library. The librarian seems fond of her. Apparently she has an unusual interest in cartography. He paused. Children are public figures in small ways. Schools have websites. Teachers have social media. It's a porous world. Ronan did not move. I'm not making a threat, Victor said, in the tone of a man making a threat. I'm illustrating the reality that information about your daughter exists in various places and can be amplified or not amplified, depending on choices that get made. I'd prefer it not be amplified. I suspect you feel the same. A car moved slowly down the street. A crow landed on the power line above the workshop and shifted its weight and looked at nothing. You have 72 hours to consider, Victor said. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a card on the porch railing. Call that number when you've thought it through. He stepped back, smoothly. I genuinely hope you make the sensible choice, Mr. Whitaker. I have no interest in making your life difficult. I simply need a problem resolved. He went back down the porch steps, unhurried, and got into the car that was idling at the curb. Ronan stood at the open door and watched the car pull away. The card sat on the railing. A plain card, good stock, a phone number printed on it, no name. He picked it up, looked at it, put it in his pocket. Then he went inside, closed the door, locked it the deadbolt, which he didn't usually bother with in the middle of the day, and stood in his own hallway in the particular silence of a house that is currently empty, of everyone who lives in it, and therefore feels like a held breath. He thought about what he knew. He knew Victor Halden had orchestrated the press campaign. He knew the goal was to destabilize Lenora before a board vote that was now less than 2 weeks away. He knew the strategy had been to make Ronan into a liability, to paint him as a fortune hunter, and paint Lenora as someone whose judgment had lapsed. He knew that Victor had come here in person, which meant the press campaign alone hadn't been enough. Which meant something had shifted in Victor's calculation, some element of his plan wasn't proceeding as expected, and he decided to go directly for Ronan as the variable he could most easily control. He thought about what Victor had said about Sadie, the school, the librarian, the cartography. He thought about the way the man had said it, that particular careful cadence, every word placed with the precision of someone who knows exactly which ones will land where. He thought about Lenora and the board vote and the things she'd said about not being able to appear reactive because that was what Victor wanted. He thought about the card in his pocket, and then slowly something clarified. Not immediately, it moved through him the way understanding sometimes does, quiet and without drama, arriving at a place he hadn't planned to reach by a route he hadn't known he was walking. Running away isn't protecting Sadie anymore. It hadn't been, since the moment Victor Halden got out of that car. Because if Ronan gave him the statement, if he stood in front of a camera, or signed something, or did what the man had come to his house to ask, it wouldn't end there. That was not how people like Victor ended things. Compliance was not resolution. Compliance was leverage, and leverage got used and used again. He'd thought that leaving Lenora's orbit would remove Sadie from the radius of whatever was building in that world. He'd been wrong. Victor had come to his house anyway, had mentioned his daughter's name anyway, had stood on his porch and used the word cartography like a key being turned in a lock. The danger had followed him home, whether he'd invited it or not, which meant the only thing walking away had actually accomplished was leaving Lenora without someone in her corner who had a reason beyond professional interest to fight. He took the card out of his pocket and put it on the kitchen table. Then he picked up his phone. He didn't call Lenora. Not yet. First he called Marcus Webb, who was a contractor he'd done several jobs for over the years, and whose brother-in-law was an attorney who handled, among other things, Business litigation. Marcus was confused by the call and asked if Ronan was building something. No, Ronan said. I need a contact for your brother-in-law, and I need you to not mention this to anyone. Is everything okay? It will be, Ronan said. I'm working on it. He made 2 more calls to an archivist he'd met through a trade contact who had significant experience with document authentication, and to a retired investigator who did work for insurance companies and occasionally for individuals. The investigator's name was Celeste Park, and she'd done a background check for Ronan 2 years ago on a client who'd been slow to pay and slower to explain why. Celeste answered on the 3rd ring. I have something I need help documenting, Ronan said. Records, messages, a pattern of press activity. I need it organized in a way that holds up. What kind of documentation are we talking about? The kind that exposes a coordinated campaign against a private individual. Business records, communications, timing patterns, and press releases. A pause. This is going to take more than a week. The event I need it for is in 11 days. Another pause. That's tight. I know. What do you need from me to start? He heard her pull up something on her end, the click of keys. Everything you have. Any communications, any records of contact, dates and times of press items. Anything that shows a coordinating thread. Bring it all. When can you meet? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, the afternoon light coming through the window at the low angle of winter, laying a pale stripe across the table where Victor's card still sat. 11 days. The board vote was in 11 days, and Victor Halden had walked up to his house and said his daughter's name and described her habits in the careful way of someone filing information away. And Ronan had spent 4 weeks telling himself that the right thing to do was to be gone and quiet and out of it. He'd been wrong. He wasn't going to go to Lenora and tell her he'd changed his mind. He wasn't going to make some declaration or reverse the distance he'd created between them or pretend the last month hadn't happened. That wasn't what this was. This was something simpler and more stubborn. A man who had been told, in not quite so many words, that his 8-year-old daughter was a piece on someone else's board, and had decided, without drama or announcement, that he was going to remove that piece from the board entirely. He'd call Lenora tonight. He'd tell her about Victor's visit, not all of it, not the part about Sadie's name, not yet, but enough. He'd tell her what he was doing. He'd tell her that he needed access to anyone in her organization who had documentation of the internal communications she'd mentioned, the ones that showed evidence of manipulation. He'd tell her he was going to be at that board meeting. But first he needed to pick up Sadie from school. He checked the time. He had 40 minutes. He went back to the workshop, cleaned up the bench with the efficiency of someone who needed the occupation, and tried not to think too far ahead about what he was setting in motion. He mostly failed at that. But the bench was clean by the time he needed to leave, which was something. He told Sadie that evening that things might get a little more complicated for a while before they got better, which was as honest as he could be, without telling her things that were his to carry and not hers. She looked up from the new country, which had acquired a name since yesterday, Kestal, with a K, she specified, because a C would imply a different phonetic register, and she'd decided the language in Kestal had hard consonants. How complicated, she asked. I don't know exactly. She considered this with the gravity she brought to geological plausibility. Is it because of the lady in the news? Partially. Are you going to fix it? He met her eyes. His daughter, who drew rivers where the geology put them, and contested borders into her imaginary countries and elevation markers into her mountains, because she wanted to be accurate about things that mattered. Yeah, he said. I'm going to fix it. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this as a commitment, and went back to the coastline of Kestal. He called Lenora at 9:15, after the nightlight was on, and the house had settled. She answered on the second ring. I need to tell you something, he said. And then I need you to tell me who in your organization has the communications records I'm going to need. A silence. Ronan, she said carefully, what happened? Victor Halden came to my house today. The silence that followed is different from the others, shorter, and with a quality of compressed attention in it, the way a person goes very attention-till when they've just heard something that confirms a fear they'd been managing. Tell me exactly what he said, she said. He did. When he finished, Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a deliberateness that he recognized as the voice she used, when she was managing something very large and very carefully, he mentioned Sadie by name. He mentioned the school, the class, the teacher, the librarian, a pause. He called it illustrating the reality. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice was the same controlled, precise, But there was something beneath it that he'd heard once before, on the night she'd told him about Victor and the board vote. Something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to be at your board meeting," he said. "With documentation. I need 11 days to put it together. I need access to whoever in your legal team has the internal communications." "Ronan, I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what's happening so you can get me what I need." A pause. He heard her breathe. "My general counsel is named Patricia Anand," she said. "I'll call her tonight. She'll have everything you need by tomorrow afternoon." "Good." And Ronan. Her voice shifted, just slightly still controlled, but with something in it that wasn't professional and wasn't managed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I might make a mess of it." "I doubt that." "You shouldn't. I'm a carpenter." "You're also," she said quietly, "the only person who's come to me with something I didn't ask for in a very long time." He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wasn't too large for a phone call at 9:15 on a Tuesday night. "I'll be in touch when I have something concrete," he said. He hung up. Outside, the street was quiet. The workshop light was still on. He'd forgotten to turn it off. Through the window, he could see the bench, the half-shaped piece of cherry, the wall where Sadie's first map of Verath was pinned, the rivers running where they were supposed to run, the elevation markers where the terrain required them. He went out and turned the workshop light off. Then he came back inside and got to work. The 11 days were the hardest work Ronan had done since the first year after Marissa left. That year had been hard in a specific way: the logistics of grief, the reconfiguration of everything, learning to be both parents at once while running a business that was still finding its footing. This was hard differently. This was the kind of hard that required him to operate in a world he didn't know, using tools he hadn't previously needed, under a deadline that was fixed and immovable and carried consequences he couldn't fully predict. Celeste Park turned out to be exactly what he'd needed without knowing he'd needed it. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her forehead until she needed them, and a manner of complete, unsentimental focus that reminded him, oddly, of Lenora, not in personality but in the specific quality of her attention. She listened to everything he told her without interrupting, took notes in a small spiral notebook with a mechanical stencil, and at the end of it said, "You have more than you think you have. People like this leave more of a trail than they believe." What kind of trail? Timing, mostly, and communication patterns. She tapped her notebook. The press pieces, the specific outlets they ran in, the specific language that repeated across publications that don't share editorial staff. That doesn't happen organically. There's coordination. Coordination leaves fingerprints. She looked at him over her glasses. "I'm going to need access to the internal communications your contact at Blackthorne can provide. You'll have them tomorrow afternoon." "Good. I'll also need the business records from your workshop, the restoration contract for the hotel, invoices, payment records, anything that documents the legitimate nature of your professional relationship with the company." "That's easy. I have all of it." "Don't assume it's easy," she said. "Easy documentation that's well organized is the foundation. People underestimate paper." She wrote something. "One more thing. The visit from Halden, did he touch anything? Leave anything besides the card?" "Just the card." "Keep it. Don't handle it more than you already have, but keep it." He kept it. He also, on the drive home from Celeste's office, thought about the visit in a way he hadn't yet allowed himself to, not the content of it, which he'd processed and set aside, but the fact of it. Victor Halden, who ran executives and managed boards, and had presumably never had reason to visit a furniture workshop in a residential neighborhood, had come to his house personally, had stood on his porch, had delivered the threat himself rather than through intermediaries. That was, Celeste had pointed out when he mentioned it, either a sign of confidence or a sign of desperation. If his plan was working the way he expected, she'd said, he wouldn't have needed to go in person. The press campaign alone would have been sufficient. The fact that he escalated to a direct visit means something stalled. What stalled? That's what we're going to find out. Patricia Anand turned out to be a small, brisk woman in her late 40s who spoke in complete sentences at a pace that suggested she'd long since stopped having patience for people who couldn't keep up. She met Ronan at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Blackthorne Hotel's headquarters, which was not where he'd expected to meet Lenora's general counsel, and arrived with a leather briefcase and an expression that communicated, without hostility, that she was reserving judgment. "Lenora speaks highly of you," she said, setting the briefcase on the chair beside her. "She didn't need to sell me," Ronan said. "She didn't. She simply told me what you found and what you're proposing to do with it. Patricia folded her hands on the table. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Whitaker. What you're proposing appearing at the shareholder meeting is not without risk to you personally. If Victor's team decides to respond by escalating the narrative around you, it could be unpleasant. More unpleasant than him standing on my porch and describing my daughter's school schedule. A pause. Something shifted in Patricia's expression, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. No, she said, probably not. She unclipped the briefcase. Here's what we have. What they had was substantial. Patricia had clearly been building her own file on Victor. Independently, she had internal email chains that showed communication between Victor and 2 of the 3 wavering board members in the weeks leading up to the press campaign, communications that predated the first published photograph by nearly 3 weeks. She had financial records showing payments to a media consulting firm that had, through a chain of referrals that Celeste would later spend 2 days unraveling, connections to 2 of the outlets that had run the most pointed coverage. She also had something Ronan hadn't anticipated. Evidence that Victor had attempted to access financial records that were outside his authorized scope, specifically records pertaining to Lenora's discretionary accounts, which he'd have needed in order to fabricate the allegation he was apparently planning to present at the board meeting. He didn't succeed in accessing them, Patricia said. Our systems flagged the attempt and locked him out. But the attempt itself is documented. He was going to claim she transferred money to me. That's our working assumption. A fabricated transfer small enough to be plausible, large enough to look like favoritism or a conflict of interest. She looked at the papers between them. Without being able to access the actual records, he couldn't fabricate a real transaction. But he may still present the allegation and let the board demand an audit, which would take time, which would delay the vote. Which is the point. She reordered a page. The vote is in 9 days. If he can inject enough uncertainty to push it past the quarter, he gets more time to consolidate his position with the 3 uncertain members. Ronan looked at the documents. He was not a lawyer and did not have a lawyer's facility with this kind of material, but he had spent 11 years running a small business, which meant he had developed, out of necessity, a practical literacy with contracts and invoices and the documentary paper trail of commercial transactions. He understood what he was looking at well enough to follow the shape of it. What do you need from me? He asked. Your records. Complete records of every transaction between your workshop and Blackthorne Hotels. The original contract, all invoices, every payment confirmation. She paused. And the documentation your investigator is compiling on the press coordination. If she can establish the timing pattern clearly enough, it corroborates our internal evidence. She can establish it. Patricia looked at him for a moment. You're very certain. She's very good. What's your plan for the meeting itself? He told her. She listened without expression, which he was coming to understand as her version of concentration. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, that's direct. It's all I know how to be. Lenora said that too. A brief pause, the first thing approaching warmth he'd seen in her. She said, you told her the truth about a drywall screw, the first time you met her. It was a bad screw, apparently. Patricia closed the briefcase. All right. I'll coordinate with your investigator. We'll have the documentation organized before the meeting. But I need you to understand something. She looked at him directly. Once you walk into that room, there is no version of this where you remain a private person. Whatever you've experienced in terms of press attention, so far it gets more intense, not less, after this. I know. Your daughter, I've thought about it. He met her eyes. The alternative is letting him win, which means he has leverage over Lenora and over me indefinitely. That's worse for Sadie than a news cycle. Patricia held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the precision of a decision made. Then let's make sure what you bring into that room is airtight. He saw Lenora once during those 9 days. Not planned. He was coming out of Celeste's office on the 6th day, late afternoon, the sky already going dark in the early winter way. And Lenora was standing on the sidewalk outside the building in a coat he hadn't seen before, and they both stopped. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. She was still composed, she was always composed, but there were edges to it that weren't usually visible. A slight tension in the line of her jaw, something in her eyes that was managing rather than settled. I didn't know you were meeting with Celeste today, he said. I wasn't. I had a meeting with a client in this building. She looked at him. I didn't plan this. I know. They stood on the sidewalk with the late afternoon foot traffic moving around them, people in coats and scarves, a delivery bike cutting through, the ordinary sounds of a city in motion. "How is it going?" she asked, meaning the documentation. "Well, Celeste is good. She's been extremely useful. She's the best I have. It shows." A silence, not uncomfortable, but weighted with things neither of them was addressing directly. "How are you?" he asked. Something moved briefly in her face, not hidden, but passing. "Managing. The board members I'm certain of are solid. The three uncertain ones," she paused. "They've been cautious with me this week. More cautious than usual. Victor has been working them. Patricia thinks he's going to present the fabricated transfer allegation. Yes, even without the actual documentation to support it, the allegation alone might be enough to push a delay." She looked at the street. If the vote gets delayed, he has more time. He's counting on more time. He's not going to get it. She looked at him. There was something in her face that wasn't quite relief. It was more complex than that, more careful. Like someone who wants to trust something and is working out whether it's safe. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've said that. I mean it. What he did coming to your house, what he said about Sadie, you could take that to the police. You could take it to a civil attorney. You don't have to walk into a shareholder meeting." "I know." He looked at her. "Do you not want me there?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid of what it costs you. That's mine to calculate. You have a daughter." "I'm aware of my daughter, Lenora." The words came out with more edge than he'd intended. She didn't flinch from them. "I know you are," she said. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to manage you." "I know you're not." He exhaled. "I've run the calculation. Every version of staying out of it ends with Victor having something he can use. That's worse than whatever comes from walking in." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of looking that takes inventory. "You're doing this for Sadie," she said partly. And partly, he looked at her. At the managed exhaustion in her face, the cost of holding this much together for this long alone. At the woman who'd sat across a kitchen island eating Lebanese food from containers and told him she'd spent a week thinking about his daughter's rivers. "Partly for the reason I should have been clearer about before I walked away," he said. She didn't say anything, but something settled in her face, not relief, not quite. Something quieter, like a thing that had been braced against impact and found instead solid ground. "4 more days," he said. 4 more days, she agreed. They parted on the sidewalk without anything more than that, which was enough for now, and more than either of them had managed to in the 4 weeks they'd been out of contact. The morning of the shareholder meeting, Ronan drove Sadie to school himself rather than putting her on the bus. She knew something was happening she'd known for days, in the way she knew things, without being told specifically. She'd been quieter than usual at breakfast, more focused on her maps in the evenings, asking fewer questions and listening more carefully to the answers when she did ask. In the truck, 3 blocks from school, she said, "Is today the day?" "Yeah," he said, "today's the day." She looked out the windshield. "Are you scared to stop?" He thought about the honest answer. "A little. Mostly I just want to get it done." She nodded, still watching the street ahead. "Dad." "Yeah, you said you were going to fix it." "I know I did. I believe you." She said it simply, not as encouragement or reassurance, just as information. A statement of position, the way she stated geological facts. He pulled up at the school. She gathered her backpack, her library book, the new Kestall map, folded carefully inside a folder she'd made for it out of cardboard and tape. "I'll be at pickup," he said. Okay, she got out, swung her backpack on, and turned back. "Dad, tell the lady I said the Northern Range is right. I looked it up, and the geology supports it." He stared at her. "For Verith," she clarified, as if he might be confused about which imaginary country she meant. "The mountains. The design is correct." He found his voice. "I'll tell her." Sadie nodded, satisfied, and went through the school gate. He sat in the truck for a moment after she disappeared into the crowd of kids and coats and backpacks. Then he drove to the Blackthorne Hotel's corporate headquarters, parked in the public garage on the adjacent street, and sat for another moment. He was wearing the navy jacket again. It was the only jacket he owned that was appropriate for the occasion, and it still looked like what it was, a department store jacket, bought 4 years ago. He'd considered buying something else and decided against it. He wasn't here to look like something he wasn't. He took the folder of documents from the passenger seat. Celeste had organized everything with the precision of someone who understood that a document's credibility depends as much on its presentation as its content, labeled, tabbed, cross-referenced, with a 2-page summary at the front that laid out the structure of the argument in language clear enough for someone to follow while under pressure. She'd gone over it with him twice. He knew it well enough to navigate it without notes. He got out of the truck. The Blackthorne Hotel's corporate headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that had been designed to communicate stability and permanence, and had largely succeeded. The lobby was all marble and filtered light, with a reception desk and a security checkpoint, and the kind of ambient quiet that wealthy organizations cultivate deliberately to make visitors feel simultaneously impressed and slightly small. Ronan walked through it. The shareholder meeting was on the 32nd floor. He'd confirmed this with Patricia the day before. Along with the process for guest entry, he was listed as a witness in a legal context, which was technically accurate and had been arranged by Patricia with the efficiency of someone who had thought them through the precise manner of his arrival. He gave his name at the desk, received a visitor badge, took the elevator. The 32nd floor was different from the lobby, the deliberate quiet replaced by the specific controlled activity of a major corporate event. People in suits moving with purpose. A cluster of what appeared to be analysts near one wall. 2 men in conversation, who stopped when Ronan stepped off the elevator and looked at him with the blankly evaluative attention of people who are very good at identifying who belongs and who doesn't. He found Patricia near the entrance to the main boardroom, recognizable by the briefcase and the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "You're on time," she said. "I said I would be. Victor is already in there. 3 of his allied executives are with him. He arrived early, which he doesn't usually do." She kept her voice level and low. "He's planning to move before the agenda gets to the scheduled items. Start with the allegation and force the room to respond to it. That changes the timing. It changes the opening. Not the substance." She looked at him. "When you go in, you go to the table. Not the side of the room, the table. It matters where you stand." "I know, Ronan." She met his eyes. "Don't let him talk over you. He will try. He's very good at it." "So am I," he said, which was not something he'd said before and was also simply true. Patricia allowed herself a small, brief expression that was not quite a smile. Then she pulled the door open. The boardroom was a long room with windows on one side that looked out over the city, a table that seated 20, and currently held 14 people board members, executives, legal advisors, stenographer in the corner. Lenora was at the head of the table, and she looked up when the door opened. Her face, when she saw him, was the most controlled thing he had ever witnessed a person do with their face. Victor Halden was 3 seats down on the right, and his face was not controlled. It moved through something surprise, calculation, the brief and involuntary expression of a man who has just seen a variable he didn't account for enter the room before settling back into the pleasantness Ronan remembered from the porch. Ronan walked to the table. He set his folder down. He did not sit. Patricia had been right about that, and he'd understood it instinctively. He stood at the table. "My apologies for the interruption," he said to the room generally. "My name is Ronan Whitaker. I'm the owner of Whitaker Custom Restorations. I completed a restoration contract for Blackthorne Hotels 6 weeks ago, which is the documented origin of my professional relationship with this company." He opened the folder to the first tab. "I'm here because I have documentation relevant to business before this board today, and I was advised by Ms. Blackthorne's general counsel that this was the appropriate context in which to present it." The room was very quiet. A board member at the far end, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, said, "What documentation?" "Evidence of a coordinated campaign originating within this organization to manipulate press coverage and fabricate financial allegations against Ms. Blackthorne in advance of this vote." Ronan kept his voice even. He was not a public speaker and did not have a public speaker's ease, but he had the voice of someone who said what he meant, and in a room full of people who had spent careers listening for the distinction, it carried. "I'll walk through it." He walked through it. He started with the workshop records, invoice, contract, payment confirmation, the complete and boring documentary evidence that his relationship with Blackthorne Hotels was professional and entirely transactional. He laid it on the table where the nearest board members could see it. He moved through it without rushing, without editorializing. The way Celeste had coached him let the documents say what they said. Then he moved to the press coordination. Celeste's analysis was laid out in 3 pages of timeline, an annotation the originating piece, the subsequent placement in outlets that didn't share an editorial connection, the specific language that repeated verbatim across publications, the timestamps that showed a coordination pattern inconsistent with organic pickup. She'd marked in red the phrases that appeared in 4 or more pieces with no logical common source. There were 11 of them. "This is circumstantial," Victor said from his seat. His voice was relaxed. Press coverage of public figures isn't evidence of coordination. It's evidence of interest. That's fair, Ronan said, which is why I have this. He turned to the next tab. The financial records the payments to the media consulting firm, the chain of referrals, the timeline connecting those payments to the first press placement. This is a payment record from Halden Strategic Communications, a firm registered to a holding company with a director connection to Mr. Halden to Meridian Media Group, dated 3 weeks before the first article ran. Meridian has documented relationships with 2 of the outlets that ran the initial coverage. Silence. Victor's face had not changed expression. This was, in itself, a kind of answer. I'd also note, Patricia said, from behind Ronan she'd come in quietly and was standing at the side of the room, that our IT department has a logged record of an unauthorized access attempt on Ms. Blackthorne's discretionary financial accounts, originating from Mr. Halden's network credentials 9 days ago. The attempt failed. The log did not. One of the 3 wavering board members, a man in his 50s, who'd been watching the proceedings with increasing care, said, "Victor, what is this?" Victor set his hands flat on the table. This is a carpenter who walked into a boardroom with a folder of papers he doesn't understand, being used as a prop in a legal strategy by a woman who is trying to deflect legitimate questions about her judgment. "My judgment," Ronan said, "isn't on trial here." He held Victor's gaze. "Yours might be." A board member he didn't know said, "The access attempt, Patricia, is that documented with IT? Fully documented, timestamped and logged by the security system. I have the IT director available to speak to it directly if the board requires." The woman with the reading glasses on a chain said, "I'd like to see the payment records." Ronan slid the relevant pages down the table. She examined them, passed them to the person beside her. Victor said, "These records can be contested." The interpretation is not ambiguous," Patricia said. "The payment timeline, the access attempt, and the press coordination pattern constitute a coordinated effort to manipulate the board process. I'm filing a formal complaint with the relevant regulatory body this afternoon, regardless of the outcome of today's meeting. I wanted the board to be aware of it." The room was the kind of quiet that has weight. Ronan had more in the folder. He had a tab he hadn't used yet, the visit to his house, the specific language, the information about Sadie. He'd prepared it carefully, included a written account dated and signed, included the card Victor had left on the railing. He'd planned to use it if the room needed to understand the full scope of what had been deployed. He looked at the room now and made a decision. He closed the folder. The room already knew enough. Adding the personal material, the porch, Sadie's name, the school would shift the register of the conversation in a direction that served his anger more than the outcome. He'd had it there as a last measure. It wasn't needed. Victor was looking at him. Still composed, but the composure had changed quality. It was now the composure of someone holding something together that has begun to show stress fractures. "I have additional documentation," Ronan said to the room. "I won't present it unless the board has questions the current record doesn't answer." He paused. "What I want to say is then I'll sit down or leave. Whichever the board prefers is that I came into this building today because a man came to my house and used my 8-year-old daughter as a negotiating point. I don't have a stake in this company. I have no financial interest in the outcome of this vote. What I have is a folder of documents that tells a clear story, and the belief that the people in this room are capable of reading it accurately." He looked at the board members, the woman with the glasses on a chain, the man in his 50s who'd asked Victor the question, the others, whose faces told various things he couldn't fully interpret. "Ms. Blackthorne," he said, and looked at Lenora for the first time since he'd walked in. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, not the controlled composure, not the brief reluctant smile. Something more exposed than either. Something that had stopped performing and was just present. "She runs an extraordinary company," he said. "I know that because I restored a desk for one of her hotels and she asked the right questions about it. And I know it because in 6 weeks of dealing with the fallout of a manufactured scandal, she never once tried to use her resources to pressure me into anything. She let me walk away when I asked her to." He paused. "Whatever else you think about her judgment, that's the judgment of someone who understands that respect isn't a negotiating tactic." He closed the folder. "That's all I have," he said. The vote happened that afternoon. Ronan waited in a small conference room down the hall with Patricia and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and they didn't talk much, which suited both of them. Celeste texted once to ask how it had gone. He replied, "Don't know yet." She replied, "The documentation held up?" He replied, "Yes." She replied, "Then it held up." 2 hours and 20 minutes after the meeting started, Patricia's phone buzzed. She read the message. Looked up. The vote went 14-0 in Lenora's favor, she said. Victor has been suspended pending investigation. 2 of the 3 wavering board members voted with her. Ronan put his cold coffee down. The third, he asked. Abstained. Patricia allowed herself a full expression now, not quite a smile, but something like satisfaction. An abstention, given the circumstances, is essentially a vote. He just didn't want to be on record. She put her phone away. Lenora would like to speak with you. She's in her office. He took the elevator to the floor above, which was where her office was. Her assistant showed him in, without making him wait. The office was not what he'd have designed for her. It was what an office of that scale and significance required: the views, the furniture, the dimensions of it. But there were things in it that told him something. A small frame drawing on the desk corner that he couldn't see clearly from where he stood, and a map on the far wall, not a world map, not a design element, but a topographic map of a coastline he didn't recognize, detailed and specific, the kind of thing someone put up because they wanted to look at it. Lenora was standing by the window. She turned when he came in. They looked at each other across the room. 14-0, he said. Yes. Her voice was controlled, the way it always was, but there was something in it that was coming up for air. Victor's attorney called 12 minutes after the vote. He's exploring his options, apparently. He won't find many. No, Patricia is thorough. She paused. You were thorough. Celeste was thorough. I was present. You were more than present. She looked at him with the directness he'd first noticed over an antique desk in a hotel suite. You came back. Yeah. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. I did. She crossed the room toward him. Not quickly, not with the hesitation of someone uncertain, just directly, the way she moved through everything she'd decided to move through. She stopped a few feet from him. I owe you an apology, she said. He frowned. For what? For underestimating the exposure when I invited you to dinner. For not telling you about Victor sooner. For letting you walk away without making it clear enough that she stopped. Found the words more carefully. That it mattered. What was happening between us? I let it be something I was managing instead of something I was honest about. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to manage it. That's different. She held his gaze. I'm not good at letting things be unmanaged. It's not something I've ever needed to be good at. I know. I'm aware that's not an excuse. I know that too. He looked at her. I walked away. That's also on the record. You walked away because my world came after your daughter. I walked away because I was scared, he said, and the honesty of it, unvarnished and offered without softening, landed between them cleanly. Not just of the press or the attention, of all of it. How different things are. What it means to be in the middle of your life. He paused. I'm still a little scared of that. She looked at him. So am I. Of what? She was quiet for a moment. That in a year or 2 years, the difference between what I am and what you are is going to feel too large. That you'll look at this. She gestured at the office, the windows, the view, and decide it isn't worth the translation. He thought about the things she'd said to him at Fenwick's 6 weeks ago over candlelight, in a voice that had been utterly confident, and also he now understood, not entirely. You told me you'd make me fall for you exactly as you are, he said. She looked at him. You were right, he said. That's what happened. The room was quiet. The city moved in the windows behind her, 40 floors down, small and continuous and indifferent to the specific gravity of the room they were standing in. She stepped forward and he met her, and what happened next was not dramatic in the cinematic sense, no soundtrack, no swept-up moment. It was 2 people who had both made mistakes and both held their ground and both come back to the same place anyway, and it was awkward in the way real things are awkward, slightly off balance. His hand finding her arm before either of them had fully committed to the movement, her breath audible in the quiet. He held her, standing in the middle of a boardroom floor 32 stories up, with his department store jacket and sawdust probably still in the creases of his hands. She held him back. After a while she said against his shoulder, I need to call the board members. I know, and Patricia needs a debrief. I know. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then she pulled back and looked at him. And the controlled composure was there, but it was different now, not a performance, but a settled thing. Something that didn't have to work as hard as it used to. Sadie, she said. How is she? She wanted me to tell you the northern mountain range on Vareth is geologically supported. She looked it up. Lenora went still for a moment. Something crossed her face that was private and complicated and not managed at all. She did, she said. She does her research. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She sounds like someone I'd like to know better. She is, Ronan said, and she will. He picked up his folder from where he'd set it on her desk. He looked at the small framed drawing. In the corner he could see it clearly now. It was a hand-drawn map, simple lines, careful topography. A mountain range along a northern coast. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Lenora. She met his eyes without explaining it, because she didn't need to. He went to pick up his daughter from school. He was 20 minutes late to pick up. Not dramatically late, not the kind of late that sets off alarms, but late enough that Sadie was one of the last 3 kids still standing by the gate when his truck pulled up, her backpack on, her folder of Kestal maps under her arm, her expression communicating with precision that she had noted his tardiness and filed it appropriately. She got in, buckled her seatbelt, looked at him. "Well," she said. 14-0, he said. She considered this for a moment. "Is that good?" "That's very good." She nodded, satisfied, and looked out the windshield. "Did you tell her about the mountains?" "I told her." "What did she say?" He pulled away from the curb and thought about Lenora's face when he'd told her the way something private and unmanaged had moved across it, the thing she hadn't tried to contain. She seemed glad to know, he said. Sadie accepted this and opened her folder to the Kestal coastline, apparently done with the conversation now that the essential information had been exchanged. He drove them home through the early dark of winter, the city doing what it always did at this hour, the headlights and the street lamps, and the particular compressed energy of a place where people are moving from one part of their day to another. He was tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that comes from holding something at tension for a long time and finally being able to set it down. He was also, underneath the tired, something he didn't have a clean word for. Not happy, exactly too complicated for that. Not relieved, though relief was part of it. Something more like landed. The specific feeling of having moved through a difficult piece of air and come through the other side with the plane still in one piece, which is not triumph, but is its own significant thing. The weeks after the board meeting were not simple. He'd known they wouldn't be, and Patricia had warned him, and Celeste had been characteristically blunt about it. The story gets more complicated before it gets quieter. Prepare for that. She'd been right. Victor Halden's suspension generated its own press cycle, and Ronan's was in it this time, not as a suspicious figure, but as the person who'd walked into a boardroom with a folder and changed the outcome, which was in some ways a better story and in some ways just as invasive. He read some of it and stopped when it started to feel like it was shaping how he thought about his own life. That was the specific hazard of press attention. He'd been most unprepared for not the hostility, which was manageable, but the way reading about yourself in the third person could slowly start to feel like the accurate version if you weren't careful. He focused on the work instead. The library installation in the hills took 3 more weeks to complete and was, in the end, one of the best things. He'd built a floor-to-ceiling shelving system with a rolling ladder and integrated cabinet work that the client had initially sketched on a napkin and that Ronan had spent considerable time translating into something that would actually function and last. The client cried when she saw the finished installation, which had never happened to him before. He didn't know what to do with that, so he checked the anchor points one more time and told her the wood would settle for 6 months before it found its permanent position. "And then," she'd asked. "And then it'll be there for 100 years, he'd said. He meant it. He'd built it to last. Sadie, meanwhile, was navigating the changed atmosphere at school with the practical efficiency that characterized most of her navigation of difficult things. The attention had shifted from the vague, whispered curiosity of the first press cycle to something more openly interested, which in some ways was worse. 3 separate kids asked her if she'd been on television. One asked if she was going to be rich now. She'd reportedly told the last one, with Sadie-level directness, that her dad was a carpenter and wasn't going to be rich regardless of who he knew, which struck Ronan when she reported it as both accurate and slightly hilarious. Priya remained unfazed by all of it, which was its own form of loyalty. He and Lenora found their rhythm gradually, in the imperfect and occasionally awkward way that rhythms actually form between people who are genuinely different and not pretending otherwise. They talked on the phone more often than they met in person, partly because the logistics of her schedule and his were genuinely complicated, and partly because the phone, for now, was the right pace. It kept the conversations honest without the additional variable of proximity. She was not easy to know. He'd understood this intellectually before he'd understood it in practice. She had habits of self-containment built over decades that didn't dissolve because she decided to trust someone they received slowly, incompletely, with regular reversions to the managed version of herself that was her default under pressure. There were evenings when he called, and she was so deep inside, whatever the company was demanding, that the conversation felt like talking to someone through a wall. She was present, technically, but the most alive part of her was somewhere else, and she knew it and was faintly apologetic about it without being willing to fully stop. He recognized this. He had his own version of it days in the workshop, when Sadie came in to show him something, and he had to physically make himself stop and turn and be actually there, rather than the version of there that keeps one eye on the work. Nobody who is good at something and cares about it is immune to the pull of it. He didn't hold it against her. He told her so. "You're more patient than I expected," she said once, on one of those evenings. "You expected impatient?" "I expected I don't know. Needs I couldn't meet." "I have needs," he said. "They're just not the ones you're worried about." "What are they?" He thought about it honestly. "I need you to be real with me. Not managed. And I need you to understand that what I have the workshop, Sadie, the two-bedroom house that's not a placeholder. That's the thing." A pause. "I know that. Do you?" "Yes." Another pause, shorter. It took me longer to actually believe it than to say I believed it. But yes. He accepted that distinction, because it was the honest version, and the honest version was always what he needed more than the polished one. They disagreed too, with more frequency than either of them had been prepared for. She had opinions about everything that touched her professional life, and the velocity with which she made decisions in that sphere occasionally translated, badly, into the personal. She made a reservation at a restaurant for a Thursday evening without confirming he could make it, assuming Mrs. Carver would be available, and he arrived 20 minutes late and irritated, and they had a meal that was technically pleasant and actually tense. She apologized afterward genuinely, without qualification, and he accepted it, and they agreed that the logistics of his life required more consultation than she was used to extending. He forgot to tell her about a school event she'd specifically asked to attend. He'd simply blanked on it the way you blank on things when you're carrying too much, and she'd found out afterward and hadn't said much, which was, he was learning, her particular form of disappointment. He apologized and she said it was fine, and it wasn't entirely fine, and they worked through the unfine part slowly over the following week, which was how it was supposed to go. There was no version of this that was without friction. He'd known that going in. Knowing it and living it were different exercises, and he'd be lying if he said there weren't moments usually late at night, usually when he was tired, and she was distant, and the 18 years and the different worlds, and the fundamental implausibility of the whole thing piled up when he wondered what exactly he thought he was doing. But then there were other moments. The first time Lenora came to the house was 6 weeks after the board meeting, on a Sunday afternoon in early spring when Sadie had specifically requested the visit and had cleaned her room with unprecedented thoroughness in preparation. Ronan had watched his daughter vacuum her own floor without being asked and felt, in some distant chamber of himself, the particular moved, helpless feeling of a parent watching their child care about something. Lenora arrived in a car. She drove herself not a car that suited the house or the neighborhood objectively, but she'd made the decision not to arrive differently than she arrived, and he respected that. She stood on the porch, and she did not have the uncertain quality of a person entering a world that was assessing her. She had the attentive quality of someone who wanted to get it right. Sadie met her at the door with the Kestel maps. Not hello. Not any of the social formalities that adults scaffolded around first meetings. Just, I want to show you the contested border region. Lenora looked at the maps, then she looked at Sadie. Where does the dispute originate? Geographic resources. The river delta on the eastern coast controls access to most of the agricultural land in the lowland territories. The northern faction claims historical precedent. The coastal faction claims it in the current constitution. What does the constitution say exactly? I haven't written the constitution yet. I'd start there, Lenora said. Historical precedent is subjective. A constitutional framework at least gives you defined terms to argue from. Sadie stared at her for a moment. Then, come in. Ronan made coffee and stayed mostly out of it. He was present. He sat at the kitchen table and worked on a design problem for an upcoming commission, but the main event was in the living room, where Lenora sat on the couch with Sadie and asked questions about Kestel with the focused attention of someone who had decided this mattered and was going to give it what it required. He heard Sadie explaining the phonetic logic of the language's consonant structure, and Lenora asking a follow-up question about whether the written form had a directional convention. He heard Sadie say she hadn't decided yet. He heard Lenora say that was probably the right call, that the writing system should emerge from the culture rather than being imposed on it, which would require him knowing more about what the culture actually was. He heard Sadie go quiet in the particular way. She went quiet when someone had said something worth sitting with. He looked at his design problem and did not look up, and the thing in his chest that had been building for 6 weeks arranged itself into something he recognized as the real version of what he'd told Lenora in her office, not just the words, but the weight behind them. She stayed 3 hours. She stayed for dinner, which was pasta and a salad that was mostly Ronan's and a bread from the bakery 2 streets over that Sadie had reminded him to buy. They sat at the kitchen table and ate, and Sadie asked Lenora about hotels, not the business of them, but the experience, specifically whether it was strange to own the beds where strangers slept. And Lenora said she'd stopped thinking about the beds a long time ago, but that she still occasionally walked through a lobby and thought about all the specific moments the building was containing simultaneously, all the individual reasons people were there, which was, she said, the most interesting part of the industry, and also the one no revenue report could capture. Sadie said, that's sort of like how geography contains history. Lenora put down her fork and looked at the 8-year-old across the table. Yes, she said. That's exactly like that. After dinner, Sadie went upstairs to work on the Kestel Constitution, which she'd decided to begin immediately. Ronan walked Lenora out to her car in the cool evening air, the street lamp making a circle of yellow light on the sidewalk. She turned and looked at him. She's extraordinary, she said. I know. I don't mean that as a compliment to you, though it is. I mean it as a thing about her. She's going to be someone. She already is someone. Lenora looked at him. Something moved in her face, the private thing, the unmanaged one. Yes, I can see that. They stood on the sidewalk, and the evening was ordinary, and the street was quiet, and neither of them said anything grandiose about the moment, because the moment didn't require it. She was standing outside his house, in his neighborhood, having spent 3 hours on his couch, learning about an imaginary country's constitutional crisis, and this was not the life she'd designed or anticipated, and she wasn't treating it like something to be accommodated. She was treating it like something she wanted. He kissed her on the sidewalk under the street lamp, which was the first time he'd done that, and it was awkward in the small way that first kisses between people who have been circling each other for months always are. Slightly off-center, her hand coming up to his arm to adjust. Then not awkward, then simply what it was. Good night, she said. Drive safe. She got in the car. He stood on the sidewalk until she turned the corner, and then he went back inside and locked the door, and went upstairs and knocked on Sadie's room. She gone? Sadie said, without looking up from the draft she was writing. Yeah, she's good, Sadie said. The highest designation in her vocabulary. She understood about the delta. I know. Not everyone gets it. I know. He leaned in the doorway. You okay? She looked up. Why wouldn't I be? Just checking. She considered him with the equanimity of someone who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. She didn't treat you like you need fixing, she said. Some of the others did. He'd had 2 relationships in the 5 years since Marissa left. He hadn't realized his 8-year-old had been keeping track of the metrics. No, he said. She doesn't. Good. Sadie went back to the Constitution. Then it's fine. He went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen, in the small quiet house, and found that it was, in fact, fine, and that fine, understood correctly, was not a diminishment but the actual word for solid ground. A year and 2 months after a photographer stood across the street from Fenwick's. On a Friday night, Ronan drove back there. Not for a special occasion in the planned sense he hadn't made a reservation, had called the restaurant that morning and asked if they had a table for 2 that evening, and the hostess had told him they had one opening at 8, and he'd taken it. He'd worn the navy jacket. It still fit. He'd bought it 5 years ago, and it still fit, and he'd decided that was sufficient. Lenora knew they were going to Fenwick's. She didn't know why he'd told her. He wanted to go back to the beginning of something, which was vague enough that she'd accepted it without pushing. She'd pushed on other things in the past year, on things that deserved pushing, and had learned the specific geography of when he needed to be asked and when he needed to be left the space to arrive somewhere himself. He picked her up at her house, his truck in her driveway, which still looked incongruous in the way it had always looked incongruous, and which he had stopped noticing, except occasionally as a kind of running joke with himself. She came to the door in something dark and simple, her hair partially down, the watch she always wore. She looked exactly like herself. Fenwick's, she said in the car. Fenwick's, he confirmed. Any particular reason? You'll see. She looked at him sideways. I find it mildly irritating when you do that. I know. She looked back at the road ahead and did not pursue it, which was its own form of trust. They got the corner table, not the same one, technically, but close enough. The restaurant was the same, the ambient wealth of it, the quality of the quiet, the candlelight that turned everything slightly golden. Ronan had felt out of place here once, with his department store jacket and his work boots, in a particular sharp way that he no longer felt, not because he'd become something different, but because he'd stopped measuring himself against the room. He was a carpenter with a small workshop and a daughter who was currently writing a constitution for an imaginary country. The room was a room. They ordered. Wine arrived. The good kind, the kind that tasted like money, and he'd come to appreciate it as a specific thing rather than an abstract marker. They talked about the things they talked about. A hotel renovation she was managing in the Northeast that was more complicated than the original assessment. The Victorian sideboard repair he'd finished last week that had turned out to be more interesting structurally than expected. Sadie's latest development, she'd finished the Kestal Constitution and had begun with a focus that verged on the alarming, mapping its trade routes. She's decided trade precedes diplomacy, Lenora said. She told me this Wednesday. You two talked Wednesday? She called me. She had a question about how port infrastructure affects trade volume. I told her I knew something about that. He looked at her. She called you. She did. Something warm and slightly careful in Lenora's face. I hope that's all right. He looked at his wine glass. The thing in his chest, the landed feeling, the solid ground feeling moved with a specific quality he recognized as the feeling of something being more than he'd thought it would be. Yeah, he said. It's all right. They ate and talked, and the evening moved in the way. Good evenings move with the quality of time that doesn't feel like it's being spent, but like it's simply being inhabited. He thought about the first time they'd sat here, the discomfort he'd walked in with, the moment she'd said her outrageous line over the candlelight, and he'd gone very still. The photographer he hadn't known was there. He thought about everything that had followed. The press cycle and the school, and Sadie's face at her desk, with her finger on the mountain range. Victor on the porch. 11 days and a folder of documents in a boardroom 32 stories up. The framed map on the corner of her desk that she'd never had to explain. After the main course, in the quiet stretch that settled between them the way quiet, settled between people who had learned each other's rhythms, he reached into the inside pocket of his navy jacket. He put the ring on the table between them. It was not an extravagant ring. He'd spent longer choosing it than he'd spent on some furniture commissions, going to 4 different jewelers, looking at a lot of things that were too much or too little or just wrong, in a way he couldn't name, until he found this one, a simple band with a single stone, not large, the setting clean and uncluttered, the kind of thing that looked like it had been made for someone rather than for the concept of someone. He'd had it for 3 weeks. He'd been waiting for the right moment, and then he'd stopped waiting for the right moment and just decided on the place. Lenora looked at the ring on the table. Then she looked at him. He held her gaze across the candlelight. You said you'd make me fall for you exactly as you are, he said. You were right. That's what happened. Exactly as you are the parts that are difficult, and the parts that shut down when you're under pressure, and the parts that read trade reports at 11 o'clock, and the part that sat on my couch for 3 hours, learning about an imaginary river delta. He paused. All of it. That's what happened. Lenora was very still. I'm not offering you anything extraordinary, he continued. I have a workshop and a 2-bedroom house and a kid who will probably have opinions about your constitutional process. I'm not going to become someone different, and I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you want to be in the same life. He looked at her. As you are. All of it. The restaurant continued its quiet around them. Somewhere behind him a glass clinked. The candlelight held. Lenora Blackthorne, who had spent 30 years in rooms full of people who wanted something from her, who had learned composure as a survival skill and worn it so long it had become indistinguishable from her face, who had orchestrated negotiations and managed crises and sat at the head of a table of 14 people and held everything together, looked across at a carpenter in a 5-year-old navy jacket and let her face do what it was going to do without trying to manage it. It wasn't a dramatic dissolution. She didn't cry. She wasn't someone who cried easily, and she didn't pretend otherwise. What happened was subtler than that. The particular quality of her expression changed. The one that was always doing slight work, always managing slight distance, and it just stopped. And what was underneath was a woman who had been genuinely unexpectedly, against all reasonable calculation, found. Yes, she said. He picked up the ring and put it on her hand. It fit because he'd made a guess about the size and gotten lucky, which felt like the right way for that to go. She looked at her hand, then at him. "You chose Fenwick's," she said. "Beginning of something," he said. "You said that in the car." "I meant this." She looked at the ring again. Then something crossed her face, the brief, reluctant smile. The one from the first night, the one that looked like a concession. Except it wasn't reluctant this time. It was just her, smiling, without the armor. "You know," she said, "I had a very good line the first time we sat here. I remember the line, and it worked." "Insufferably well," he said. She laughed, the real kind, the one you can't manufacture, and across the table from her. Ronan Whitaker laughed too, and the candle between them burned steadily. And neither of them reached for the performance of the moment, because the moment was already doing exactly what it needed to do. They married 7 months later in a private garden ceremony at a house in the country that Lenora owned and rarely used, which turned out to be, once you were standing in it on an afternoon in late autumn with the leaves coming down and a small crowd of people you actually trusted, precisely the right place. Sadie stood beside them. She had opinions about this role. Naturally, she'd asked specific questions about what it involved, had confirmed that she would not be required to carry flowers, and had worn a dress she'd chosen herself in a shade of blue she described as correct, without further elaboration. She was 9 now, taller than she'd been in September, more certain of herself, in the way children become more certain of themselves when they've been consistently believed. The ceremony was short. They'd both wanted that not because they didn't mean it, but because what they meant didn't require a lot of performance. Ronan said what he meant in plain language, not searching for the elegant version. Lenora, who could speak to a board of 14 without notes, had written something on a piece of paper and read from it anyway, because, she said, she'd wanted to get it right. She said, "I've spent my adult life getting things right by controlling as many variables as possible. You're the first thing in a long time that I couldn't control. I didn't expect to be glad about that. I am," Sadie, standing beside them, said in a perfectly audible whisper to no one in particular. "That's accurate." Ronan made a sound that was mostly a suppressed laugh. Lenora composed herself with visible effort and mostly succeeded. Later at the small dinner they'd arranged under string lights in the garden, Sadie gave an unsolicited speech because she was Sadie, and the idea that she might have a relevant observation and withhold it was not consistent with her operating principles. She stood up at the table with her sparkling cider and said that she had decided Lenora was good for several specific reasons, which she then listed with the organizational clarity of someone who had recently completed a constitutional document. The reasons included that Lenora understood about the elevation markers, that Lenora did not treat her father like someone who needed improving, and that Lenora had correctly predicted that the Kestel constitutional dispute would benefit from a defined framework. Also, Sadie said, she brought good food the last time she came over for dinner, which matters. Patricia Anand, who was one of 12 guests, laughed her first fully unguarded laugh in what seemed like years. Mrs. Carver dabbed at her eyes. Celeste Park, who'd accepted the invitation on the basis that she'd earned it, raised her glass. Ronan looked at his daughter and felt the specific, undramatic weight of a life that was, against the odds and against various forces that had attempted otherwise, exactly what he'd built it to be. Not perfect, not smooth, not the kind of life that made sense from the outside until you were standing inside it. He kept the workshop. That had never been in question. But Lenora had asked, at one point, genuinely and without pressure, whether he'd ever considered doing something on a larger scale, whether there were ambitions he'd set aside that might be worth returning to. He'd thought about it honestly, because she deserved honest, and said no. He'd had bigger ambitions once, earlier, before Sadie in the workshop had clarified what he actually cared about, and what he'd discovered when he examined them was that they'd always been about proving something to someone else, rather than building something he actually wanted. The workshop, the specific quiet attention of making a thing that would last, the way a piece of well-made furniture holds its purpose, decade after decade, that was the thing. It had always been the thing. She understood this in the way she understood things when she was done managing and actually listening. She didn't return to it. Lenora, for her part, learned to leave the company with a consistency that cost her something real and was worth it. Not perfectly, there were evenings Zim was present when the phone was present in a way that meant she was only partially there. They'd learned to name that without drama when it happened. But the window seat in her house, the one with the crumpled blanket he'd noticed on his first visit, saw more use now. He'd seen her there on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of tea, and nothing that looked like work, looking out at the garden with an expression that was simply present. He hadn't said anything. He'd gone back to what he was doing. But he'd noticed, because he noticed things. The press moved on, as press does. Victor Halden's legal proceedings made news for a while, and then that too became yesterday's story. Ronan's name appeared occasionally in the way that spouses of public figures' names appear not as the subject of a story but as a piece of context, mentioned and moved past. He found this preferable and did nothing to alter it. The age difference didn't disappear. He'd never thought it would, had never wanted it to, because it was part of who she was, the 52 years that had made her, the decades of specific experience and hard-earned instinct, and the particular way her mind worked, all of it built from the time she'd had. Sometimes he was aware of the gap between what she'd already understood when he was still a teenager and what he was only now figuring out. He found this interesting rather than diminishing. She was ahead of him in some things, and he'd come to see it as a kind of resource, the same way he'd come to see the vast difference in their bank accounts as simply a feature of the terrain they lived in, something to navigate. Honestly, not something to pretend wasn't there. What he understood, more clearly than anything else he understood, was this: there is a version of love that is about finding someone who fills the space you have. And there is a version that is about deciding that the space you have is where you want them to be, not because they fit easily, not because the edges are smooth, but because you've looked at who they are, all of it, the difficult and the extraordinary and the ordinary and the flawed, and you've decided that's the one, the specific one, the non-substitutable one. He'd spent 2 years alone before Lenora, telling himself the solitude was fine and mostly believing it. He'd thought he was built for a particular kind of life, contained, manageable, organized around Sadie, and the workshop, and the useful occupation of making things that lasted. He wasn't wrong about any of that. He'd just been wrong about the limits of it. The limits had turned out to be further out than he'd drawn them. On a Sunday in February, 14 months after the shareholder meeting and 6 months after the garden ceremony, Ronan was in the workshop when Sadie came in. She still came in this way, the doorway appearance, the assessment of whether he was at a stoppable point, and said that Lenora wanted to know if he could come inside. Is something wrong? No. She said she has something to show you. He set down the plane and wiped his hands and went through the interior passage to the kitchen, where Lenora was sitting at the table with her laptop open, and an expression he'd learned to read as the one she wore when she'd done something. She wasn't certain how he'd receive. On the table beside the laptop was a rolled paper. He looked at it. "What's that?" "Unroll it," she said. He unrolled it. It was a map. Hand-drawn, careful, detailed a coastline with a complex northern mountain range and an eastern river delta and a contested border region marked with delicate cross-hatching. The topography was technically precise in a way that spoke of genuine research. In the lower right corner, in small, neat handwriting, it said Kestel, after the constitutional settlement, and beneath that, smaller still, for Sadie. The rivers are right. He stood at the kitchen table holding the map. "She told me the trade routes last week," Lenora said, behind the careful expression. "I thought the constitutional settlement deserved documentation. I've been working on it for 3 weeks." He looked at the map, at the rivers where the geology put them, at the mountain range along the northern coast, correct by someone who had looked it up. He thought about a moment on a sidewalk outside a restaurant more than a year ago, when a voice behind him had said the elevation markers, and something had moved in the arrangement of things he'd told himself were settled. He looked at his wife. She was watching him with the expression she'd stopped trying to manage the real one, the present one, the one that had stopped performing and was just there. "She's going to love this," he said. "I know." Lenora looked at the map. "I wanted to get it right." He stood in the kitchen of his small house, in the life he'd built and not abandoned and chosen again, and understood the way you understand things that have arrived slowly and without announcement, that this was what he meant when he said he'd fallen for her, exactly as she was. Not the moments of eloquence, not the boardroom and the folder and the line she'd delivered over candlelight. This, a woman at his kitchen table, who ran $4 billion worth of enterprise and had spent 3 weeks getting a river delta right for a 10-year-old's imaginary country, because the 10-year-old mattered, and the rivers mattered, and getting things right was the only way she knew how to love people. He rolled the map carefully and went to find his daughter. Some things don't resolve cleanly, some gaps don't close. Some worlds remain, stubbornly, different from each other, no matter how much goodwill exists between the people living in them. The differences between Ronan Whitaker and Lenora Blackthorne did not disappear because they chose each other. They simply stopped being the argument against it. That, in the end, is what choosing someone actually means. Not the absence of reasons to hesitate. The decision to stay anyway, not in spite of who they are, but because of it. All of it. The difficult parts and the extraordinary parts, and the parts that are just ordinary and human and yours. He found Sadie at her desk, already deep in the trade route documentation. He set the rolled map on her desk without a word. She looked at it, unrolled it. Read the note in the corner. She was quiet for a long moment, which for Sadie was its own form of significant. Then she picked up her pencil and went carefully back to her trade routes, and Ronan stood in the doorway of his daughter's room, and the house was warm. And outside the winter afternoon was doing what winter afternoons do, going quietly toward dark, ordinary, and sufficient, holding everything it contained.